Good evening, everybody. I am Sam Blake, and I'm the founder of Murder One and also the author of The Dark Room that you can see just behind me here. And we are thrilled this evening, this year, to be working with Laoghaire-Rathdown Libraries and the DLR Lexicon to bring you Murder in the Library. This evening, we have two amazing authors with us. We are bringing you Joanne Harris, who is a multi-genre bestseller, who has written everything from a Doctor Who book to psychological thrillers. Declan Burke is our man on the ground, and he is an award-winning author who's the author of The Laminsters, is the most recent one, critically acclaimed, and he's going to be quizzing her on her new book, A Narrow Door. So, over to you, Declan.
Thank you very much, Sam. Yes, indeed. Delighted to be here, folks. Absolutely. Yorkshire-based author Joanne Harris is one of the most successful and beloved authors of her generation. Perhaps still best known for her novel Chocolat, which was published in 1999 while she was still working as a teacher, and which delivered the kind of overnight success that tends to come when a writer has spent long, hard years perfecting her craft. Joanne published her first novel, The Evil Seed, in 1989, and has since published almost 30 books, multi-genre, as Sam suggested, some of which genres she seems to have invented herself. Gentlemen and Players, which was published in 2005, introduced the character of Roy Straightley, a Latin teacher of classics at St Oswald's Grammar School in Yorkshire, and who returned in the novel Different Class in 2016. And Roy Straightley also features in Joanne's current novel, A Narrow Door, which we'll be talking about. So Joanne is a member of the Elite Millionaires Club, which I didn't even know existed, but which is comprised of authors who have sold 1 million or more copies of a single book in the UK. From a personal point of view, Joanne is my favourite kind of author, the kind who defies characterisation to go wherever the story takes her. So I'm really looking forward to this interview today. Joanne,
it's great to be here. Thank you. Thank you, Declan.
Excellent. Delighted to have you.
By the way, it might not be that you've earned 1 million. It's just that you've sold 1 million. There is a big, big difference. Just trust me on this one.
Yes, indeed. I hear what you're saying. Joanne, we are going to talk about A Narrow Door, which is the current novel. Would you be happy to do a little reading for us before we start the interview, just to give the audience a sense of the tone of the characters?
Yes, of course. Thank you. Now, this book is written in two voices, like the other books. One is the voice of Roy Straightley, who, if you've read them, you will know very well. He is the old Latin teacher, still clinging on for dear life to his job in the face of all sorts of unwelcome innovations, email, whiteboards, staff changes. This year, the staff changes include a whole new regime headed by the first headmistress that St Oswald's has had for 500 years. And this is her voice. This is the voice of Rebecca Buckfast, who appeared in a different class as the deputy head of a crisis team that was supposed to bring St Oswald's out of its financial ruin. And she has stayed. She is now top of the pile, and she likes it there. I often find that men like you underestimate women like me. You think we must be damaged somehow, that we seek power to compensate for some real or imagined injustice, that we must hate men for the way they have excluded women from their boys' clubs, holding them back, abusing them, exploiting them for centuries. Well, yes, you may have a point. Some things make a woman fight back. And some things, though they challenge us, only make us stronger. A woman headmaster. To you, it must seem a reversal of everything you believe. How did we come to this, you ask? How has the world been so overturned? Women like me, you tell yourself, should be this way for a reason. Our drive to succeed comes from weakness, you think. Rage, or hate, or fear, or insecurity. And that's why I'll win. Because you believe in the essential weakness of women in authority. An old St Oswald's proverb goes, "It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a woman to enter these gates." Well, not only have I entered, but now the gates are my gates, and the rules are my rules. The mistake you made was one of scale. Men always do, used as they are to taking the main entrance. Women must be more discreet. All we need is a narrow door. And when we have crept in unseen, like a spider through a keyhole, we spin ourselves an empire of silk and fill you with astonishment. I'm really very fond of you, Roy. Don't think that because I opposed you last year, I don't have a lot of respect for you. But you are part of the old school, and I belong to the future. I don't suppose you know what that's like. You've always been part of St. Oswald's. Man and boy, you always belonged. You never needed the narrow door. And even after what happened last year, you still believe I have a heart. How little you know me, Straightley. I have survived more setbacks than you could ever imagine. I had my daughter at 17 without ever naming the father. I entered teaching at 23 in a school very like St. Oswald's. I fought for my place every step of the way through prejudice, sexism, and judgment. I have survived the death of a spouse, an elder sibling, a love affair. I have seen my parents die, my daughter move to America. I have committed 2 murders, one a crime of passion, the other a crime of convenience. I am barely 40 years old, and finally I am starting to reap the harvest my ambitions have sown. This is my time, Mr. Straightley. And no, I am not damaged. I am whole.
Excellent. Terrific. Getting the chills down my spine yet again after reading that and then hearing it. It's always lovely to hear in the author's voice, I think, because the author always knows best how the character sounds in their mind. Can I take you way back to the start, Joanne, just to start? Both of your parents were teachers and you yourself started writing while still a teacher. Was it inevitable, even though the first St. Oswald novel arrived belatedly in the career, was it always inevitable that teaching would find its way into your fiction?
I think it was inevitable. I thought initially that I could keep it out of my writing. I think I was slightly afraid of going back to that place. And also, I think, some of my colleagues were still alive. And so I just pretended that I hadn't been writing about teaching from the start. But it's clear to me now that I was, when I was teaching at Leeds Grammar School, which was a boys' school in the north of England, not entirely unlike St. Oswald's. I was part of a small community, and it was a very particular kind of community, and there were a lot of things happening there. There were a lot of little dramas and interpersonal conflicts and the kind of stories that only really happen in a school environment. And initially, I just disguised them. I was surrounded by mostly elderly gentlemen and teenage boys. And so I think it was inevitable that Chocolat, which I wrote when I was teaching there, should have so many of those characters in there. All I had to do really was to look around at my colleagues and just transplant them from one community to another and add a little local colour. And they seemed very much at home there.
Very good. You have written an open letter to readers as part of the novel that came to me. And of course, you say that, like virtually everybody, your first memories are of being in school as a pupil. So
That's
I suppose it's more a surprise that more people don't write about school. And certainly my early experience, particularly with Enid Blyton, reading about boarding schools and so forth, I devoured all those novels. I'm curious about your own earliest influences as a reader. Can you remember back to the first books that really gripped you to the extent that you were then persuaded that you needed to put your own words on the page?
Well, I read a lot in French because French was my first language. And so there were a lot of children's books in French that I read. There was particularly an author called Georges Chollet who wrote these kind of energetic thrillers with a teenage heroine who was also a masked crime solver in her spare time. And a lot of those stories were set partly at school. where you had to guess which character was actually the masked heroine. I guess pretty early on, but she was a fairly formative influence in my reading choices. In English, I read pretty much anything that came my way, but my mother, who was quite a strict parent when it came to reading material, stopped me from reading sci-fi or horror or anything like that. So I read mostly, I got my fantasy fix from reading folklore and legends and myths. And the first book I remember being completely obsessed with was a book by Dorothy G. Horsforth, and it was called Thunder of the Gods, and it was about Norse myth. And I just loved these stories of this community of besieged gods living in their little citadel and basically at war with everything.
Yeah, and narrow, excuse me, a narrow door, as many of your novels tend to be, is littered with mythological and folktale allusion. Can I ask you about the title first before we get to talk about the characters? You've alluded to it in the reading that you did. The narrow door. What is the door specifically, and why is it so narrow?
Well, the door is the entrance to the patriarchy, and particularly in St. Oswald's, it's been pretty much shut to women since its existence. And this is very much, it's a feminist novel. It's about a woman who is in a situation where she has only a limited amount of power compared to the people around her. Much of it focuses on the young Rebecca Buckfast and her early entry into teaching. And she shares a few experiences with what I underwent when I entered teaching. I started teaching at a comprehensive school and then moved to a boys' grammar school where I was a completely alien person there. I was one of maybe 5 or 6 women teachers. And it just seemed that I had to work 10 times harder than anybody to get anything at all. And so when I created Rebecca Buckfast out of all sorts of bits and pieces, I put some of that experience and some of that frustration. And it's very much about a woman's struggle to be something in the face of a patriarchal system that doesn't want her to.
Yeah, and not only doesn't want her to, but is actively designed to keep her beyond the narrow door. Door's been usually used to keep people out. Roy Straightley, who returns for the 3rd time in this novel. Just for those readers who haven't come across Roy to this point, Joanne, would you give us a sense of who he is and who he is really at the start of this novel, who he has become?
Well, Straightley is a man who was once the head of a whole department of classics, but is now the only classics master left at a school which has been hauled kicking and screaming into the 21st century. He is past the age of retirement, but he is holding on to his job because, for a start, he has nothing to go to. He has no family, he has no friends outside of St. Oswald's. He's devoted to the old place and to his boys. He's very much one of the old guard. So he has some traditional ideas about how a school should be run, which have mostly been superseded by new traditions. And he's not happy about this, but he's also very stubborn. Down, he's a good and principled man, although he's not always made great choices during his career. But St. Oswald's is very much his family. He was a schoolboy there. He became a schoolmaster there. He's been there the whole of his career, and that's where his loyalty is. And he is particularly bereaved this year because he's lost his best friend to dementia, a friend who left the previous year under a bit of a cloud, and whose story we've only just begun to learn.
Yes, indeed. A considerable cloud. We won't say too much about it, except to say that the more I learned of Roy's relationship with his friend, the more sympathy I started to feel for Roy, because, as with all good friends, we can maybe forgive the sinner if not the sin, and Roy was a good example of that, I think, in this novel. Rebecca Buckfast is the nemesis, I suppose, that Roy is confronted by, as you say. and he does feel really threatened by her. I'm intrigued partly by the number of names that Rebecca is given during the course of this novel. For example, Roy, he refers to as La Buckfast, slightly sneeringly, I think, at the start of the novel, but there's a gradual respect as we go through. That idea of names and the power they confer or take away is something that's ancient in terms of folklore and mythology. Is that one of the reasons that we were dealing with so many names?
I think it is one of the reasons, yes. And also because this is a woman who has had a number of different incarnations and has still the ability to project different facets of herself to suit different circumstances. It's part of her power. It's part of the reason she is where she is. She's been very good at using whatever power she had, which was limited. And she's very good at dissembling. She's very good at lying. And in spite of the fact that she tells the reader early on that she's whole, she's also survived a great deal of damage, which still, to a certain extent, haunts her. And much of this story is really about her past and why it's important to this current present.
Sure. At one point, Roy, because he is a classics and particularly Latin teacher, he makes an allusion to the metamorphosis. And ironically, doesn't seem to realize that Rebecca is probably the best example of metamorphosis in this novel.
Yes, indeed, she is. She has reinvented herself a number of times to become the person she is, who is the person she wanted to be. But much of her backstory, if you like, is about the young Becky Price and her quest to survive the damage that she's experienced as a child. As a 5-year-old, she lost her elder brother, who disappeared from school when he was only 14, and she was there, but was obviously so traumatized by whatever happened that she wasn't able to tell the police who took him, if anyone took him, what occurred. All she could say is the monster took him, Mr. Smallface took him down into the drains, which is clearly her way of processing that trauma, but which hasn't been useful in terms of locating her brother who never turned up. And her whole family has been destroyed by this, and there's a kind of giant hole in Rebecca's past and her personality that she has tried to fill in various ways.
Very good. The novel proceeds by way of private communications. Effectively, it's an old literary trope that you're almost employing here, which is fantastic for me personally. Again, was that a conscious decision? I'm going to employ the kind of almost the way that characters used to write letters to one another back in the great old day of the classic novel.
Yes, I did. Most of my books are written in two voices in this way. And my St. Oswald's books particularly are dialogues. They have all been constructed as chess matches. Sometimes you know who the narrator is, sometimes not. In the case of Rebecca Buckfast, you know who she is straight away. But this is the third chess match with Roy, obviously, as the White King. And it's an interesting form to use for me because it means, first of all, I can really explore the inner workings of the character. But also, I can allow for a degree of external knowledge. There are some moments where Buckfast is speaking to Straightley, and you know she's doing that. And there are other times where she speaks directly to the reader. And so you know things that Straightley doesn't know, and it allows for a level of suspense in this kind of unreliable narrative that she's telling the other character.
Sure. Excuse me. As is generally the case with your novels, you know, it's a multi-layered story in which the personal is very much the political. And there is a merger that forms a backdrop of the story that Rebecca is determined to, having driven through make manifest. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why it was so important to Rebecca?
Well, initially, Rebecca Buckfast has decided to make a number of changes to St Oswald's, including the creation of a number of new facilities, particularly for girls, which she has introduced into the school the year before. In the earthworks of one of these, a group of pupils who are particularly close to Straightley discover what they think are human remains. And this is the thing which prompts Buckfast to tell her story. She has a personal link with the discovery of these remains, and it takes a while to work out exactly who they belong to. But the story needs to be told. But she really doesn't want Straightley to go to the police straight away. She wants first to divulge her part of it, because she feels that the discovery at this stage is going to be damaging to the school. And this, of course, is the way Straightley is pulled in, because he's so very close to St Oswald's. The idea that it's come to the brink of ruin twice already in previous books, that the fact that another scandal might bring it down completely, it's just too much for him to bear. And so it becomes a story within a story in the grand old tradition of storytelling. And it's not so much a who is it, but a why is it, and why this narrative is important to the present day. And so it's a bit like an onion skin. It's layer by layer. It has to be unwrapped until finally you get to the centre of it, which is a series of genuine tragedies.
Yeah, about halfway through, I was thinking that most novels of crime narratives tend to fall into the why done it or the who done it. But you obviously got bored of that and said, why don't we have all of that and the rest? It's an incredibly satisfying novel, Joanne, if I can say that much.
I'm really glad you thought so.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And also. And a hugely added dimension. It's difficult to read a novel like this, I think, in the wake of Brexit, if I may dare introduce that word. Here in Ireland, we will perceive Brexit being a disaster for the UK, and largely perpetrated
and from where
by...
I'm standing, it feels the same too.
Just as I suspected, because it has been largely perpetrated by the kind of politicians who would have graduated from these grammar schools, these public schools, and have populated the halls of Westminster for time immemorial. And that's why I think Rebecca's mission to widen this narrow door has much more far-reaching consequences. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. St Oswald's would love to be the kind of fine public school that might have future prime ministers. In fact, it's not. It's a second-rate private school that might have the odd famous person, but it's still run with the same sense of self-satisfaction. And Gentlemen and Players, which is a reference to the two entrances at the cricket ground at Lord's, was all about class and how difficult it is for a certain class of person to get into St Oswald's. And it was inevitable that at some point I would write about women, which was even less likely. But yes, there is a lot of politics in there, I guess, in many ways. A lot of much as I love Roy Straightley, his attachment to this vanished world is something that I completely disagree with, even though I was part of it. I taught in it. I was good at what I did, and I ended up fitting there. I never felt that it was something that I wanted to perpetrate at all. It's Buckfast may be in many ways guilty of all kinds of things, but what she is doing is genuine progress.
Absolutely. You have referenced mythology and folk tales, and as I said, the book is fairly littered with allusions. And of course, the Runa series of novels, is that how you pronounce the
yes, rune novels like rune marks and rune light, yes.
The fascination with folktale and mythology, that began early with you, is that right?
Oh, very early, yes. I was always interested in myths and legends, and it just seemed to me that they were great stories, and I wanted to read more and more of them. But also they are the stories that tend to run alongside and inform the stories that we tell. we have this incredible tradition of fantasy, folklore, fairy tale, myth and legend in Europe. And it's just so interesting to pull strands from it and investigate why it's still relevant. And to me, fairy tales and myths have been a way of accessing what's important to people, how they talk about the things that are difficult to talk about except through the lens of metaphor. And in the same way, young Rebecca Price, who has witnessed something that has traumatized her, is only able to talk about it through the lens of fairy tale and metaphor. And so there's this strand of fairy tale. And of course, legend and classical references are the language of Roy Straightley. And so these two narratives keep meeting in different ways to just touch each other and to connect. One is coming from the language of the subconscious. One's coming from language of classical education. Both are closer to each other than you'd expect.
Oh, absolutely. I found that aspect of it fascinating. This idea of the collective unconscious and these archetypes, these narrative archetypes that come up generation after generation after generation, and the perception that the young Rebecca has of the trauma that occurred and the way that that's teased out, worthy of Stephen King. I thought in that the way that Stephen King tends to be incredibly good at tapping into deep and kind of ineffable fears, but making them, very much vivid. So we've talked a little bit about Rebecca's various names being are being awarded or given different names. It's not just names that's important in this book, but also titles. It's interesting at the start where Roy refers to Rebecca as the new headmaster, and she doesn't pull him up on it the first time, but then after that she insists on her correct title. But also pronouns are important in this book. Can you tell us a little bit about Benedicta, or Ben, one of the Brodie boys of Roy Straightley's Brodie boys, and who Roy perceives as a kind of contemporary version of Metamorphosis?
Yes, well, Ben has been around for a while. As a secondary character in different class when the school began to go co-ed, and there were only 6 formers who were mixed in the school. And Ben connected to a little group of Straightley's pupils who were in his form, who were younger than she was, but had something in common, partly because one of them is openly gay and has been bullied because of it. And they form a little group of pupils who don't quite fit. Ben is particularly antagonistic to the way the girls' school has been run. She particularly dislikes the headmistress of the girls' school, who wants to be good friends with all the girls and is constantly complimenting them on how pretty they are and how many boyfriends they have. Ben is quite definitely an other. It became clear to me when I was writing Ben that she was trans. She just didn't quite know it at the time, and she comes out as trans during different class. And her friend Alan Jones, who informed Straightley that he was gay quite openly when they first met, introduces Straightley to this idea. And Straightley has a terrible problem with it. He understands that Ben wants something. He never gets her pronouns right, but he is trying. He's trying to understand, and Alan Jones gently steers him back to the correct pronouns until eventually he gets it, and he realizes that actually his pupils have taught him something. And he tells himself at one point that, if he shouldn't have so much difficulty getting his head around this, because being a veteran of metamorphoses in the classical sense, it shouldn't be an alien concept. And it's not, but Straightley always takes time to process anything that's new. But he's very fond of Ben, and he counts Ben as a Brodie boy. An honorary Brodie boy at first, and then a genuine member of the group. And I like this little group. Straightley is quite unaware that he has favourites. He would be horrified if he were told that he has favourites, but they're definitely his favourites.
I struggled a little bit in the early stages of the novel with the character Roy Straightley because of his confrontation with Rebecca. It was, it verged on misogynistic, even though
he
we
is
understand
a bit.
and he's well, he is possibly as a consequence of his tradition and he's a man of a certain generation, which are the excuses we tend to give. But you do write him as a very sympathetic character. And I'm wondering if you as an author, perhaps as your own experience as a teacher, have you come to a kind of a private understanding between yourself and the Roy Straightleys of this world?
Well, I had a lot of colleagues who were like Straightley, and he's not one particular colleague, of course, but he is a kind of construct made of a number of people I dealt with, worked with, and did not always see eye to eye to, but had some respect for. And I think, Straightley is, yes, he is a bit misogynistic. He would be horrified at being told that he was, because he likes women, but he doesn't want to work alongside them. And this is his problem. He has a number of blind spots, which are his character flaws. I like him in spite of those things, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to let that pass. And so I allow that to be called out and criticized, or I allow space for the reader to do it as you did. He's by far not a perfect character, but he does have a sense of integrity. He has a sense of decency and honor, and he's deeply loyal. He's mostly a force for good, even though he is part of a decaying world which is not going to last forever, and nor is he, and he knows it.
Yeah. I'm curious, as someone who has written a number of series novels, are you the kind of writer who kind of happily returns to once, you've characters established, you've a setting established, or are you someone who thrills to the prospect of a whole new world building experience?
Oh, well, it's both, really. I do get interested in worlds, and I like the idea of expanding them, but I also don't think that my worlds are terribly far from each other. I think that what I'm actually doing with each one of my books is placing a jigsaw puzzle into a much larger picture. Roy's world of Yorkshire and Mowbray and St. Oswald's coexists at the same time as the world of Jeanne Rocher and her movements in various villages in the southwest of France, and then in Paris. And then these things are happening pretty much at the same time. They're just in parts of the world that don't have any contact, but it wouldn't take much. All it would take would be a school trip to France, and all of a sudden, boom, we could have those worlds colliding, or at least just touching for a moment. And I like that idea, and I do think that at some point I'm going to step back from my life's work, and there will be a picture that people will be able to recognize, that will have all the little pieces joined.
Very good. It's fascinating to be able to juggle all those elements. It's almost like playing multi-dimensional chess in your own mind. It's fascinating.
That's exactly what it feels like.
Yeah, I've always loved, as I said in the intro, you're one of my favorite kind of authors. People who can work across genre, who aren't particularly maybe interested in the idea of genre, which I suspect is largely a construct of publishers and marketing managers.
I think so too.
When you are coming to a new book, can I ask you about your process? I suppose is what I'm asking. Do you tend to start with a character? Is it a plot? Is it a sense of place, perhaps?
It's probably all those things. My general process is a little messy because I tend to have a way of just putting ideas together in a bag and rattling them around and just carrying them about a little bit with me to see if they form spatial relationships or thematic relationships. And if they do, then sometimes I will get part of a story. But I'm really looking for a voice, because as soon as I get a voice, I can start to explore. And I generally find that I'm led by character rather than by a plot that I've previously laid out. And so generally, if the voice is right, I will have some kind of instinctive idea of how that character would act given a series of challenges or situations, and I can start to build the plot between those interactions. And so sometimes I know a couple of episodes, I know what's going to happen at a certain point, but not quite how to get there. Sometimes I have a beginning and an end, but no middle. Sometimes I have some stepping stones, and sometimes I'm just writing in the dark, and I just hope that what's coming to me is inspiration and not a train.
Very good. Yes, the middle of the book is always the pesky part. I totally agree with you in terms of following the voice. When I first read Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, it was that voice that he employed, and that's why I ended up writing crime fiction. Had he written science fiction or your daily routine? Do I dare ask about your daily routine and how you or what is it that you do in first thing in the morning? When do you like to write?
Well, what I tend to do in the morning, I work best in the mornings. I kind of tail off after lunch, and so I tend to do, if I'm going to work, I tend to work best during the first part of the morning. So I will get up and make some tea, and I usually tweet about the shed. I go on Twitter, and I because I work in a shed, and the shed has actually acquired a personality over the years. And every day I now say what form it has taken and where it is, and it changes aspect and location according to my moods mostly. And that to me is my little Zen exercise in terms of getting into the zone. It helps me think, okay, right, this is this. I am now working. I am in my shed. This is where I work. I don't do anything else there. And I will then work. And what I do is, because I think that reading aloud is the best editorial tool any writer has. I will read aloud whatever segment I wrote the previous day, and then I will start. And there are some days when I can give it hours, and there are some days that are going to be really busy, and I can only give it 20 minutes. So I have a kind of rule that I try to write 300 words as an absolute minimum every day. So even days where it's crazy busy and I'm traveling around and I have to write on a plane or a bus or something, 300 words. That way it keeps the voice steady in my mind. It means that I'm still spinning the plates, even though I'm just keeping them in place. I'm not adding anything, but it means that I don't forget what's going on, because actually I find that, if I leave a book for a week, it goes feral. And I have to read it all the way from the beginning, and it takes lots of time that I don't always have. So that's what I do. And 300 words, even on the worst day, is still possible. And if that's all you write, by the end of a year, you've still got a first draft.
Yeah, absolutely. I do a little bit of teaching. And when I mention the fact that 500 words per day, 5 days a week over 9 months is a first draft, people tend to be, whoa, that's pretty amazing. Mm-hmm. But the discipline of doing it every day is absolutely crucial. And what I love to hear you say is that it's all about hearing the voice in your inner ear. And if you lose that, it can all fall apart.
It absolutely can. And it's much harder to pull it together again and to get back into the zone than to keep this kind of chime going in the background. I think of it as a kind of resonance. It's just much easier to grab it and to bring it back and to proceed with it. So that tends to be what I do.
Okay. One last question. I think Sam is going to have some questions from the audience. Joanne, one last question. An Arador, it's the third in what we can loosely describe a trilogy set in St. Oswald's. And without saying too much, of course, about the events of this particular novel, do you think you can see yourself revisiting St. Oswald's in the future to see how Rebecca's revolution is progressing, perhaps?
Well, never say never. I've enjoyed writing these books so much that I think it might be difficult to say that I'm never going back. It seems to me that this is the end of something that has a kind of logical progression and coherence, but it's certainly not the only story that St. Oswald's has to tell, because schools are just factories of stories. and people come and they go, and the stories remain. It's a kind of soap opera. It's the thing that I missed most when I had to quit teaching. The fact that I was no longer going to be part of this perpetual drama, tragedy, farce, this rolling panorama of stories. And so I think it's, at some point, I may drop back, or somebody may send me a postcard and it may become something.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Sam, are you there with some questions from the audience?
I am indeed. Can you hear me, Declan?
I can hear you perfectly.
Absolutely.
Excellent. This is absolutely fascinating, Joanne. Thank you so much. This is a book which is so exciting because it's so multi-layered. And I loved hearing about it being a chess game in your head. I think that's just a fantastic illustration. One of the questions I've got is about character. Declan touched there on your writing process and the 300 words a day, which I think is enormously inspirational for anybody who's trying to write a book. But when you start off with character, a particular character like Rebecca, who is so deep, and in this form of dialogue where we are really getting in to see who she is, do you plan her out at the beginning, or does she evolve as you write?
I didn't plan her out. She was a secondary character in different class, and I had her there. And I knew that she was interesting. I knew that she wasn't telling most of her story, but I didn't know what the story was. But I knew that there was something missing in her. And I thought, okay, maybe next year I will learn what that story is and what that missing piece is. And so I had something to work on, but I wanted to give her a whole full backstory of her own. And it took a while to work it out because she wasn't being particularly forthcoming at first. But those are the characters I like best.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting to hear how much you, I suppose at this point in your career, you're able to trust your subconscious. That if you know that if you wait, those things are going to come through. And I mean, that's very exciting because you don't know. I love the idea that you don't know what's going to happen right from the beginning. And I think that from a reader's perspective, that gives us a wonderful view on the book because we don't know what's going to happen either. So it's very exciting.
This is the thing. I mean, I always think that if I can't surprise myself on some level, then I probably won't surprise the reader either.
Absolutely. I think it's brilliant. It's such a beautiful book and the writing is beautiful throughout. Tell me a little bit, and then we have another question here about the Doctor Who book that you wrote, going back a bit. Was that daunting to write? Or, I mean, this is just, it's a very big thing, Doctor Who, isn't it?
It was daunting in the sense that there would be a lot of scrutiny, and there are a lot of extremely passionate Doctor Who fans out there who would know if I made a mistake. Also, it was, because it was a third Doctor story, I had to fit it into something that made logical sense. And so I had to look at all the other stories about that Doctor and find a way to fit something in that kind of game of Doctor Who Jenga that everybody is playing with their fiction. But it was great. It was a lot of fun. It was like writing grown-up fan fiction, and I just adored it.
It's very exciting. And just in terms of, I suppose it's a question from me, because your world, you're creating all these different books, this about your own work, in so many different sort of aspects of the same world, essentially. Do you keep like a character Bible and a detail Bible so you can remember what's happened from book to book? Or are you able just to do that? Do you find that maybe you're repeating names, or how do you manage this huge, because it's a big body of work now?
No, I should have kept a character Bible. If I'd been really organised, that's exactly what I would have done. But instead, no, I just reread the book. And sometimes, because I revisit generally after several years, there's no way I could remember everything, and the names and names particularly slip from my mind. And so I just read the whole thing and highlight various passages and think, okay. I do have a series of calendars, because the time scale is quite particular and none of it is set absolutely in the present day. Some of it's set 15 years ago, some of it's set 20 or 30 years ago. So I have a series of calendars where I can see where the plots have intersected so that I don't lose track of time. Or invent years that couldn't possibly have existed because something else is happening then, just in case somebody decides to go and have a look at my increasingly tortuous timeline and catch me out.
There's always avid readers out there who've read every single book, aren't they? Who know them as well as you do. Absolutely. This has been an absolute joy. It's fascinating to hear about your process. And as Declan says, a master of multi-genre, I think, is incredibly exciting. So particularly for us at Murder One, where we like to view crime and the various aspects of it as being a very, very, very broad church. It's wonderful to have you on board for this evening. Thank you so much. Huge thank you to you, Declan. Some very perceptive questions.
Absolutely. Those were great questions. I really enjoyed answering them. Thank you.
It's been absolutely brilliant.
Absolutely my pleasure, Joanne. It was an absolute treat. Hopefully, fingers crossed, the next time we talk, it might be in person. Well, wouldn't that be wonderful?
So nice. Yes,
thank you so much for the generosity, your time, and your patience. I didn't mention, I'm afraid, that the novel is published by Orion. We should always mention the wonderful publisher of the novel. But thank you so much. It's been an absolute treat.
It's been my pleasure.
Oh, it's been great to have you. And they also have the most amazing covers too, Joanne, actually, don't they, your books? So anybody who is not familiar with Joanne Harris's covers needs to go and have a look at her website and have a look at them, because they are absolutely stunning. So thank you very much indeed, both of you, Declan Burke and to Joanne Harris. Thank you so much to DLR Lexicon and DLR Libraries for supporting Murder One this year. And we look forward to seeing you very soon. Thank you.